Very common complaint towards Konami is that they keep printing cards and designing too many bulk unusable cards where there's nowhere to play them. And to be fair to Konami, it has been getting better on an infrastructural level TCG side. With the advent of Genesis format, there's a company-supported format that has frequent balance changes, communication, and a lower-level power meta. That is magnificent, and I hope they continue to do that for as long as possible. However, I think this has the potential to obfuscate a cultural problem within the TCG, or not necessarily a problem, but just something that's worth thinking about. Please bear with me because I'm having a really hard time wording my thoughts on this one, but I think in general, the TCG player base has a more difficult time playing the game in a way that is not exclusively the most competitive way possible. And I guess my issue with the Genesis solution is that since this is a company-implemented shift, the interest for this is a little bit artificial since there is an incentive to play it in prizing. And that means that the culture TCG side has not changed. Genesis is excellent, but I'm worried if Genesis were to stop getting support one day, then the players will just stop playing decks aside from the meta, which will greatly hurt less serious players, and it doesn't have to be that way. So I'm going to describe the general culture of playing the OCG because it is genuinely vastly different. My experience playing in the TCG was that you would drive to locals maybe once or twice a week, pay the entry fee, and then play those games. I only played 2 years of TCG, so maybe I'm wrong about that, but that was my experience. That's not really how it works here. Or it is. There are tournaments in locals, of course, but that's not how a lot of people, and I would even say the majority of people here play. When I first returned to China, I spoke to my friends that I had met at locals and asked what tournaments there are, and they were confused why I would even want to enter those. And that really surprised me because I didn't understand what other alternatives there were. If you come from the TCG, it is a given that you enter locals or tournaments. Otherwise, you're just going to be a DB or MD warrior. It turns out that there are a massive amount of players in the OCG who just walk into the store and then ask people to play at all times of the day, irrespective of events. And I really do mean at all times of the day. I didn't start work until September, so I had about a month before I started. And then during August, I was camping locals every single day. Like starting from noon, there are just people there in the shop trying to play games. And honestly, now that I've been back for a while, I'm a little bit confused how that's possible because they're not at school or work, but it happens. It's just a thing. The ultimate practical effect of this is that since players play outside of events, it means that there is a culture of players that will play the game irrespective of prizing and irrespective of how competitive your deck is. It sounds a little bit cheesy, but it really does feel like, to me at least, that people play here a lot more for the love of the game. So to go into more detail, it's very common for people to walk into locals with several decks and then ask around for opponents and also ask what decks people brought. And then players will self-power pair based on deck choice. A very common conversation would go something like, hey, do you want to play? I'm playing Goatee today. And then I would just respond, oh, sorry, I only brought Malice today. And it's because of this self-power pairing casual environment that people bring all sorts of different decks and you get so many pet deckers. In previous videos, I spoke about how there's so many pet deckers and that's why you walk into a local in 2025 and you see Tri-Brigade Sprite or Dragon Link, Adaemancipator, Goatee, Purely, Lab, or whatever. It's why sometimes I sit down and I play someone having never seen an archetype before. I played some guy who was playing a deck I didn't even know existed, which was apparently called Dual Avatar. The field spell summons these tokens, and then he just ended on 2 fusions. So then I asked him why he didn't link the tokens, and apparently he's fusion locked. Honestly, if he just wanted to start cheating, I would have let him. I still don't understand how it's possible that people pick up decks that are truly this terrible, but that's actually just how some people here are. But I could never imagine someone in the TCG trying to go to locals with Dual Avatar, especially because they're paying money to enter the event, and then they're going to be mostly playing against the meta. The reason this is all possible is because decks can survive when you play against things that aren't the best decks in the room, and this isn't necessarily true if there isn't this casual and self-power pairing culture in the TCG. And this is so special because not only is this another way to play for other players, but for me personally, Rogue versus Rogue is when you get some of the funniest game states in Yu-Gi-Oh! I always bring this up because it is the most hilarious thing I've seen in Yu-Gi-Oh! To date, but a Runic Stun player is playing against Kashira, and then the Kashira player makes Mind Hacker to try and reverse deck out the Runic Stun player. Like only when you get a massive amount of these casual deck players will you see things like this. I'm not saying that this never happens in the TCG. I'm sure that there are people who bring Madolche to locals, but the scale is smaller. The culture is very different, and anyone who has played in both will tell you that this is true. For me personally, I really feel like if I didn't move back, I probably would have just stopped going to locals had I stayed in the TCG. Because okay, I rightfully got flamed for saying this last year. I am not old, but I'm 24, and yet again, I'm making a video on my birthday, which means that I'm getting older. And I don't think I could maintain the motivation to drive 40 minutes to work and then 40 minutes back as opposed to just hopping on the metro. From my office to locals is 7 to 9 minutes from work. When I first moved back, I entered a lot more events, but there's only so many times I can spend 7 hours to win a deck box or some sleeves. I don't really enter local tournaments anymore either. I just go to locals and play with people. If I'm trying to test for a larger event, I can sit down with my testing group and we can get games way faster that way, and also recreate game states to collaboratively figure out how to play out situations, as opposed to the TCG where I have to look up when the locals is being held and then only go during that specific time. So why is that the case? What makes it so that East Asia has both such a strong casual player base and one that is extremely active without events? I'll go over 2 structural factors that I think aren't the real reason and then finish with the factors that I think are real. To start off with the 2 fake reasons, the first one is price. The TCG does cost more money to play, but that's mostly true in the context of playing meta decks. If you're trying to play a casual deck, it doesn't really cost that much more money, and I would even argue it's cheaper for North Americans and most Europeans. If we're using purchasing power parity, $20 for Melodious in the US, even making minimum wage in most states, is less expensive than spending $10 for Melodious in most East Asian cities because our average income is much lower. So if you're trying to buy most rogue decks, I would be very surprised if the core came anywhere close to $50 and is often less than half of that with very few exceptions such as Lab. So I don't think the cost is the reason people don't play these casual decks as often as the OCG. The second fake reason, in my opinion, is the casual tournaments. So last video, the Floodgate one, I talked about how we have 2 different types of tournaments in China, points tournaments and for fun tournaments. There's a pretty reasonable argument to make that this tournament structure causes this cultural difference. But I do think it's actually reverse causal. I believe that because we have casuals, more casuals, that created a demand for these types of free-to-play casual tournaments with special rules because many of the players that play casually don't enter any tournaments in the first place. If the casual tournaments created the player base, then it would make sense to me that they would continue to enter these tournaments rather than the opposite. Now I'll transition to what I consider to be the top 3 most important structural factors that actually stop casual culture in the West. So the first one is the raw quantity of locals. The last time I mentioned this, I got flamed a little bit because the example I showed in my video was Akihabara, and yes, obviously Akihabara is going to be the most amount of locals out of anywhere, but the place I live also has 20 or more locals within a 30-minute metro ride of me. I just didn't use a screenshot of my location because I didn't want to dox myself. It is very normal for you to have easy access to a locals no matter where you live in a big East Asian city as opposed to some cities in the US like Boston, where Yu-Gi-Oh! Locals are borderline extinct. The zoning laws in the US just make it a lot harder for there to be many locals. In North America, zoning laws are essentially exclusive, as in they'll assign 1 or 2 purposes per zone. While in Japan, for example, zoning is inclusive because they tend to tolerate anything that is up to a minimum nuisance level and allow anything under that. Basically, there is just less land available for someone to open a small business since rent is higher, and that land zoned for commercial and non-industrial use tends to be farther away from where people actually live. The second is public transportation. Now, just to preface, I want to say that I love every single country I've ever lived, and I consider each and every one of them to be one of my homes. However, the public transportation in North America is respectfully pathetic. I actually had an opportunity this year to go back to Montreal and also New York to see my friends for the first time in 3 years, and Montreal and New York are 2 cities with some of the best public transportation in all of North America, and it is still not excellent. Not only is it extremely slow, but it is also inconsistent. I took the subway in New York, and the first day I stepped in, there's a guy threatening to kill every single person in the car, and people are just laughing at that. Okay, actually that's not really fair because it's not really related to public transportation, but also my metro car got delayed by 30 minutes because they had to stop the trains for some reason. So I was late to Gamers Choice Locals. This is supposed to be the best metro in the entire US, and it is definitely far superior to something like the T in Boston, which is borderline unusable. The number one thing that bothers me about traveling to North America is since I do not live there, I don't have a car anymore, and that means I can't get anywhere. It is so frustrating. I'm pretty sure that Europe is better, the tube in London is actually okay, but it's still nowhere near as comprehensive or fast as the metro in Chinese cities. If you have never been to an East Asian city, then I'll just say you've never experienced good public transportation, which means in the West, it is hard for people to just go to locals all the time, as opposed to bigger cities in East Asia where you can just metro to locals whenever you want to play anything. Now, for these problems, I'm mostly just describing what is in reality. I'm not saying the US should just fix its public transportation. Obviously, they can't really do that for a variety of reasons, like the cost of improving public transportation is much higher than just building new public transportation because all of the people that would need the New York subway to go to work would just get destroyed, as opposed to China, which industrialized very late and thus has very new technology for its public transportation when it was building it. The population that needs public transportation the most is less wealthy, which means they have less political influence, And Americans already have car culture, so it's not really a high priority to fix it. And then there's also large car companies that are lobbying against better public transportation. It's kind of unfixable, to be honest. The last reason is that anime is far bigger in East Asia than the West, and a lot of people are naturally introduced to Yu-Gi-Oh! If they're into anime because they're deeply tied communities, which means that Yu-Gi-Oh! In the East is so big and so mainstream. I've brought this up before in older videos, and there's always comments that say, I just don't understand how big anime is in the US. That might be true, but I was there recently, and I still think many Westerners just don't know the scale for how big anime is in the East. I agree that anime is getting more mainstream in North America, but it is still nowhere near East Asia. Even the Western countries that love anime the most, such as France, don't have as much as we do. If you've been to Japan, obviously anime is massive. Everywhere you go, you will see it. It advertises for local infrastructure. The JR line in Tokyo essentially has an anime girl as the mascot. Love Live is essentially the mascot for Numazu, which is a literal city. And in China, it's the same. For context, I left China in 2014, so if you're like me and you left China a little while ago, you probably may be surprised. But back in my day, you had to go to specific areas in order to find anime stuff. And now you can't avoid it if you try. If you go out to eat, there's a high likelihood you'll hear anime music. There's limited random collaborations with all known chains. So for example, when I go to Dairy Queen, there's like random Hatsune Miku or Skip and Loafer collaborations. Cosplayers are also everywhere. I work 6 days a week. And then when I go to work in an average week, I will say there is almost a 100% chance that I'm going to see some cosplayer on the metro sometime that week. My mom actually asked me why there's so much cost now. Like, it's so big that even my mom knows what it is. When I walk to work, I see giant billboard signs that wish Itadori happy birthday. And most importantly, we have way more gacha culture than the West. I think this is the true crucial reason because TCGs are not so deeply tied to anime in the West as they are here. So you can almost expect people, my generation, early 20s, to be into something that has random purchases because it is just that omnipresent. Again, my experience is limited to bigger cities, and I'm not saying everyone does this, but if you socialize with people in their early 20s, I'd say it's very likely you will find people who buy gacha products. My friends I met at the gym or coworkers in office buildings buy these things. These are people who almost seem like the opposite consumer base, but they still like to buy random goods. To emphasize how big Yu-Gi-Oh! Is, I was at a company dinner, and then my coworker exposed me. He said, "Oh, do you all know that Sunny is a world champion for Yu-Gi-Oh?" I can feel my face burning up. I've never been so nervous before in my entire life. I don't consider myself socially awkward, but I like to keep my private and public life separate, and I'm just having all these thoughts like, will they think I'm not taking my job seriously? I can't even explain this away because if you search for me, you won't find it since it's Edison, not actual worlds. I honestly thought that was it for my job. And then my other coworker's daughter actually says, "Oh, I play too. I play with my friends during lunch. What deck do you play?" "I play Draco Tail." And I'm just unlocked because I can't tell if it's better that someone else plays or if it's worse because I have the same hobbies as a middle schooler. Anyways, I'm not fired. And in fact, my coworkers thought it was a good hobby to have. I'm only telling the story just because it is literally that big. But it's so obvious that Yu-Gi-Oh! Players here are just massive weebs. Ignoring the anime accessories, there's a reason a ton of Chinese players can just play in Japanese if they want to. Like sometimes I'll be playing and then my opponent will just be like, "これが俺の力, Demon Smith, Requiem, Koka." And I'm like, alright. I don't really know why you suddenly started LARPing in Japanese, but sure. Iyo, male lenso. I guess the reason I'm talking about this is because there's all these videos like, mid-core Yu-Gi-Oh! Is dead, the casual scene is dead. It just seems like players are very unhappy, and to an extent I do think that it is due to structural reasons. It is easier for us to have that casual player base. But I think even when I evaluate the conditions of the West, there is the possibility to enjoy Yu-Gi-Oh! The way many do over here. Because let's be real, Genesis does let you play more decks that are otherwise underplayed. But just using the example from earlier, I would be very surprised if anyone was busting out dual avatar in Genesis. It is still a competitive format at the core, and there's naturally going to be a strong meta at the top. I think that these lower power decks that never got played or outdated decks are a really fun way for casual players to experience Yu-Gi-Oh! And the player base doesn't need Konami to start that gameplay. It could be done as long as the player base itself starts playing more casually. Or not. Maybe TCG players are happy the way it is now with Genesis. I don't know because all of my TCG friends are competitive players. I just want people to start thinking about these things because a lot of what I enjoy more about the OCG is due to our player culture, not anything that Konami has done specifically for the OCG.